The Down to Business podcast is sponsored and produced by Rex Real Estate. Folks, there is no longer any reason you should be paying 6% commission to a real estate agent to sell your home. Rex sells homes for the lowest fee in the industry, period, at 2% total. That saves consumers thousands of dollars per transaction. With Rex, you get a full service team backed by technology. Rex doesn't market homes the way traditional agents do. They use big data and machine learning to attract hundreds of qualified buyers directly to your home the moment it goes on the market. Get started now by visiting rexhome.com. This is the Down to Business podcast, sponsored by Rex Real Estate. I am your host, Eric Rothman. Thank you for joining me for another episode. And today's guest, we have Brad Anderson, who is the former CEO of Best Buy, worked for the company for 36 years before retiring. And he was a really, really great guy to talk to, really generous with his time and his stories about working for a company when he started as a sales clerk at a music store called The Sound of Music, which would later become Best Buy. And he really rose through the ranks, talked about his experience there, his experience with Best Buy founder Dick Schultz, as well as what it took for him to get from the sales floor to a CEO, walked us through the rise of Best Buy from knocking off its biggest competitor, Circuit City, to dealing with kind of the internet age and evolving the business to where it is today. So really great interview with Brad Anderson. Again, if you haven't checked out the previous episodes of Down to Business, make sure you do so by subscribing to iTunes and the feed with interviews with Scott McNeely, Amit Singhal, and Diana Nelson. And this one right here with Brad Anderson. Enjoy.
Well, I was born in Sheridan, Wyoming, and I was there till I was 3.
Okay.
And then my dad was a minister, so then we moved to Fort Worth, Texas. And I was there till I was 6. And then from 6 on, I was in Minneapolis until I went to school.
And so you were talking about earlier that obviously your father being a minister, and then you had the idea of going to the seminary and kind of following in his footsteps.
He had the idea.
He had the idea for you.
Yes. And so I was cooperative enough to try it.
So what was that upbringing like, traveling around, being a part of a family, a minister, and then trying it out and finding out you didn't like it?
Yeah, well, I was always, when there's a legacy of what's called PKs or pastors' kids that generally have a low reputation for good reason. And I was, because if you can imagine as a kid having to listen to your father for a half hour a day do a speech, half an hour a week do a speech, it's challenging to. I used to sit in the back of the church in the balcony at the in pew so I could get out faster than anybody else in the congregation. But over time, actually, I found that some of what he said sunk in. But it took many years.
So how did you wind up figuring out, you know what, this type of life isn't for me, I want to do something different? Well,
I had a homiletics, which is preaching professor, and I only went to 1 year at the seminary, a little over a year. And I was very impressed with the guy, and he said, this is serious business. I mean, you're talking to people sometimes at important stages of their life, and he said, if you're really lucky, you might have one good sermon in you. And I heard that, and I thought, this guy's right, and I don't. And I couldn't picture that I ever would. So and I hated public speaking anyway. So I got out of seminary right after that.
So when you leave the seminary, what was your plan? What did you want to do?
I had no real plan. I really didn't have an idea what to do. I had gone to I had a sociology degree, and I'd gone to the Minnesota Employment Bureau, and I showed him my degree and background, and the guy at the Employment Bureau broke into laughter. And I said, "What's funny?" And he says, "I see you guys all the time. You never get jobs." So I took that, and I thought, well, what I would love to do is I was a huge music fan, and I obsessed with listening to music and collecting records. So I thought the happiest thing I ever did was buying a stereo when I was going to college. So I went to the place I bought the stereo and asked for a job, and they hired me as a clerk in the store.
And that was the Sound of Music?
That was Sound of Music. So that wound up being my career.
So you were there, so Sound of Music would later become Best Buy.
Yes.
And you were there for 35 years?
36 years.
36 years.
Yeah.
So this is kind of what fascinates me, because I think, we're in an age, especially people of my age and even younger coming out of college, where there's this kind of notion that if you spend 2 or 3 years at one place, it's almost, that's enough. You don't want to have a place on your resume for too long, and then it looks like you're stagnant, you're not growing. You were somewhere for 35 years, and you literally started out as a sales clerk and worked your way all the way up to become a CEO. How did you do it? And was there a thought behind it when you started to say, okay, this is not just a job, this is a career for me?
No, there was, I think I started with a fairly low sense of self-worth. And when I initially tried to be a clerk in the store, I wasn't successful. So I really was hoping someone would at some point want to really employ me. And it was not, so it was, and I certainly didn't, and I didn't particularly, I'm a child of the 60s, I wasn't interested in business. So there was no kind of macro plan. It was really, what happened for me was I wound up for 7 years essentially running this little 3-person store. And the company was never very solid and got into deep financial trouble, and the founder came out, and I thought he was going to fire me because he'd been firing a lot of other people. And instead he wanted to know my opinion as to which of 2 employees that had worked for me he should hire to fix the company. And I got angry because I thought, well, wait a minute, if I've got a 3-person store and you're looking at 2 people that work for me, why aren't you looking at me? And he looked shocked because I was a long-haired hippie and had hair at the time. And but he said, I need to think about that. So he came back a week later, and he divided the job of fixing the company into 2 places. And so all of a sudden I had this job of a company in deep trouble and an opportunity to fix it, but the only experience I had was running this little 3-person store.
This is really interesting. So you're self-described at this position that you're in as a salesperson and running this 3-person store, not very good. Yet when you're challenged and someone higher up than you says, you're not very good, I'm going to look at the 2 people under you to go further and succeed. It sounds like something almost kind of clicked in your head. Was that the first time that you felt maybe a little bit more empowered to take charge of what you were doing, not only for the store, but for yourself and your career? I
love the way you asked that question, because it was the first time I really took a risk that I could solve something. Right, so and it wasn't a conscious choice. Like I wasn't conspiring to get this job. It was the momentary surprise and the reaction of that. But all of a sudden, it was kind of like a freebie because the company was doing so poorly. I had the chance to try to see if I did have insights. I had worked in the store for 7 years. I'd seen a lot of customers come through the store and had developed points of view about what they weren't getting. And so all of a sudden I had a chance to try those points of view out as opposed to just complain about it.
Right. And so walk me through that progression. So when you get that opportunity and you go from a long-haired hippie salesperson and eventually become a CEO, what was that progression like over those 3 decades?
Well, the first part of it was I had to find out if some of the things I thought that I'd learned in running the 3-person store were useful. And they turned out they were. So it took a while to sort of try things. But the first thing we had to do is get the company in a position in which it was financially stable. And it's a long, long story in terms of what transpires between going from this tiny little company to Best Buy. But the central premise that was the premise I learned in that 3-person store, which is that it's one customer at a time. It's doing a better job for that one customer, meeting their needs on their terms, than it is for that somebody does competitively. And that's the core of any business. And as the company got bigger, we were just building on that same central premise. The central question is, what are you doing that's really differentiated in terms of that, what you're delivering for the customer versus somebody else?
And as you're growing the store and as you're kind of moving up the ladder, was there one specific thing that stood out to you in terms of what Best Buy or Sound of Music or whatever it was at that particular time was doing right that was translating to success in sales and growth?
Well, the Sound of Music wasn't, because that's why it was financially unstable. It was kind of a negative lesson in a sense, because I watched people make decisions in a tiny little company that I thought made no sense when it got down to us being asked to deploy them with the customer. So that developed a hypothesis that they actually couldn't hear what was happening from the customer for the reasons of whatever creates that sort of puts you in a position of being an executive. You couldn't actually hear what was going on. And that if you could invert that and actually hear the customer, you had a much better shot of making choices that were rational and would give you competitive advantage. And I think that really turned out to be true. And that struggle has continued. The bigger the company got, the harder that struggle was to meet.
You keep bringing up, obviously, understanding the customer and that one-on-one relationship, and you just kind of hinted at it, but as you get really big, it's very easy to lose that because that central management, that culture that started in 1, 2, 3 stores, as soon as you have 1,000, kind of dissipates a little bit.
Yes.
How did you manage that as the stores grew and the numbers of employees grew to make sure that the customer-centric core focus was still the focus even as you guys got bigger?
So the primary focus then has to be break it down to its simplest component. And its simplest component is when you come into a store, we can do everything we possible to try to figure out centrally how to engineer that store for the best possible customer experience, and that can help. But in most cases, the differentiator is going to be the human being that you talk to. And is that human being actually bored to tears? Or do they find enough satisfaction in the work they're doing and enough reinforcement in the work they're doing, or feel challenged enough by the work they're doing, that that you get a better experience from that employee? More than anything else, that's the key deliverable that you have to really honor in every choice you make inside that enterprise to be able to live that through. And the bigger it gets, the more challenging that job gets.
Right. So not only the in-store climate you have of dealing with those employees, but throughout your 36 years there, obviously a lot of business climate on the exterior as well that affects how you manage a business and grow a business. And if to put it broadly, at least in my head, you kind of have 3 distinct points in those 36 years. One, when you started in other similar stores like it, the idea of specialty stores, the idea of small, boutique, very specialized stuff, stereos, photography, whatever. And then it kind of moves to what we know Best Buy in its prime to be, which is that big box superstore one-stop shop. And then later on, the e-commerce revolution and moving everything online.
Yes.
How did you navigate? Those are huge fundamental changes, I would imagine, in the way you do business. How did you manage those?
Well, but they're also exciting opportunities for people that work in the company, because you can't just do what you did. At no point can you do, going back to when I started, people came to us, or customers, like I came to it as an employee, because there weren't very many places you could hear music that sounded realistic. So we were kind of purveyors of that. And when that became commonplace, all of a sudden you have to completely reinvent yourself. And then when we got to be the biggest company in this space, you sort of have to reinvent yourself. And the digital age is, you have to, that job of delighting the customer, you have more tools than are imaginable even 10 years earlier, but you have to figure out how to use those tools in a better, more effective way. It takes marshaling and inspiring the talent of the organization to do that. That's very, very exciting and scary if you don't do it right.
Is it harder? Did you find it harder to be the manager and the overseer of a company that was in its infancy and growing, or a company that was at the top and trying to stay there?
I think at the top and trying to stay there is almost fatal. in and of its. I'm a huge fan of the Innovators Dilemma, or some of the books that have been written about creative destruction. That if you think you're at the top of something and you're trying to maintain that position, you're dying. And in the consumer electronics business, the rate of death there is quite fast because of the amount of transformation. So, but you're always fighting. When I read The Innovator's Dilemma for the first time, we were the kind of smallish outcast company that is not assumed to be the successful company. So I read that book, and it was very encouraging because it said, the guy who's on top is in trouble in part just because he's on top. When we were on top, we had all of the same pathologies that go into success were there for us that had been there for our predecessors.
One of your biggest predecessors was Circuit City.
Yes.
Now in 2017, given what you just said about the Innovator's Dilemma and being on top and how difficult it is, why is Best Buy still around and Circuit City is not?
Fundamentally, it's the people. So it's that at the core, the people inside Best Buy, as they touch the customers, did a better job than Circuit City in enough ways that the company has continued to thrive and Circuit City's gone. But they cannot continue to do what we've been doing, what we built in the 90s or in the 2000 era as a value proposition, and that's. Thankfully, that's really directly being addressed by Hubert Joly and the leadership team there. We knew it back even 10 and 15 years ago. We needed fundamental reengineering. My frustration in life is that I didn't get farther when I was CEO with that reengineering. And the great thing is that they still have as big an opportunity as we had then, and more tools from which to do the innovation. And they're now really committed to doing it.
So when you were CEO, I imagine that there was, especially towards the dawn of the digital age and the onset of e-commerce business, which is something that is completely foreign to a big box retailer. Mm-hmm. What was that like? Were there moments where you kind of sat and were beside yourself going, how are we going to compete and change and adapt and innovate to keep up with what's going on around us?
No, actually, it was for me, it was exciting because all of those things are new tools coming at the ability to. So if we could figure out how to serve our customer in a way that was better than somebody else, I never thought we were a retail company. So, we were in the consumer electronics business and trying to impact. Our mission was to make life more fun. And all of these things were bringing more tool sets that could be deployed to make life more fun. Now, the challenge, of course, is you've got fixed investment and all of these kinds of things, and you're going to have to throw away potentially some of the things or at a minimum repurpose things that you already have. So there's not that there isn't a lot of fear or challenge in that space, but I think at that point in time, and certainly today, you could see many things we were not doing for customers. The customers wanted to have done, and it was the challenge to see whether or not we could get them done. And my frustration for me is while I was there, I wasn't more successful in getting more of those things done. What
do you wish you would have done? If there's one thing you can point to and say, hey, when I was in charge, I wish I would have gotten this done or been ahead of this curve, what would it have been?
If you really get down to the core, it's individualizing the engagement between a customer and all the devices that they own. So how do I own, most of us own a whole bunch of devices that have difficulty communicating with each other. And we all have single individual purposes that in our lives in terms of the way we'd use those devices. And single need sets, and they're always moving. So for me at 68, they're very different than they was when I was 38, let alone 18. So that sort of living experience, the electronics are so integrated in our lifestyle, really understanding how you enhance somebody's use of those products and make the difficulty of the technology go away in favor of the customer experience. That's we've scratched the surface.
Yeah.
There's so much that could be done that we didn't do and is yet to be done now.
And not necessarily in just the consumer electronics industry, but in terms of the brick and mortar industry in general over the past 20 years, there have always been articles or reports written that say, the age of going and shopping and being a consumer in person are over. And yet there are still innovative companies out there, some who have had the longevity of Best Buy, some who haven't, that are doing what you just mentioned, which is making it a more experiential opportunity for a consumer rather than a transactional one. Is that kind of how you see brick and mortar retail, whether it be in consumer electronics or not, kind of progressing over the next 10 to 20 years?
Yeah, and I don't really care whether it's brick and mortar or not, right? So one of the interesting things while I was at Best Buy is that Steve Jobs, he did the most unconventional imaginable thing. He took his company into brick and mortar when everybody was fleeing at the beginning of the digital age, because he was trying to do something specifically for a customer. The brick and mortar, the way he envisioned it, was useful with the Apple stores. So he followed the customer value proposition, not the conventional wisdom of the industry. I think that was a singularly brilliant move, and I think you'd argue the Apple stores were maybe the first 21st century stores that were done in a whole bunch of ways the way that was engineered. So I think there's going to be repurposing and reuse of physical stores, and lots of places where physical stores aren't going to be useful in the purpose. But I don't really think that a company should not be addicted to its habits of operation. It should be addicted to its vision for the customer and the experience of the customer.
So throughout those 36 years of being with a single company, was there ever a point in time where you thought, maybe I'd like to go try something different or a new opportunity? Never thought about leaving?
Well, no, I did back at the early stages when I thought the company was dying. So when actually I had maybe another job lined up when Dick came out, that earlier story I told you, I had another place I could go if I had to. But once I got into responsibility for where we were going, it was the opposite was the case. It was always like I could never get as much done as I had sort of this conscience of, we're not getting as much done as I know as a leader we should be getting done. So it was always the frustration of, we got to go faster, we got to get more done, as opposed to, I think I'm getting bored and I need to do something else.
Do you think a part of that was because you had been there so long, and also you had been there from the beginning of the company and had that tie and that passion to its ultimate outcome of being a successful retailer?
I think that's an interesting question because I was there when we turned it from Sound of Music into Best Buy, and it was the fabric. Today, I still care a lot about what the company is, and I've been retired for 9 years. So it does. And so, it'll always be in my fabric. So, and I'm still inspired by what we tried to do and inspired by where they're going to go. So, but there are employees that are still at Best Buy who weathered what I didn't weather, and who I would say it's probably as important to them as it was to me, who maybe other people don't know as well. I think it's are you inspired by what you're doing? And I was very inspired by what we were trying to do.
One thing that you keep bringing up is the human element, and not only as a boss, but as an employee, and then dealing with customers as well. And I think that that's one thing that kind of led to the idea of this podcast is you have all these CEOs and high-powered business people, and sometimes there's this separation between what John Q. Public thinks about a CEO or that role and who those people are versus what the reality is. And from just talking to you here for the past 20 minutes and knowing your background and your father's background, it sounds like that idea of connection to the human element and understanding the human element is something that's ingrained in you, and something that was important for you to have ingrained in the company that you were running.
Yeah, I used the job as a method to test theology. So it was kind of, I've always been, since I was a kid, I've read biographies like a junkie. I've read thousands and thousands. On this phone, I've got maybe 1,000 biographies in there. I've always been obsessed in the human experience and what we have in common and what differentiates us and what happens in our stories. So work was a way to sort of live in those stories. engage with a lot of people and their stories, and then test premises underneath that in terms of to get to the core of what I actually believed. So, I mean, you could see out of where there was shared experience and where there was things that I interpreted as truth based on enough experience in that space. And it was like a chance to experiment and get paid for doing it.
Were there times in that experimentation where, I don't know if doubt is the right word, but maybe you had doubt about the way you were going about things and
Yes.
the way you were trying to implement them?
Yes, I had periods of time in which I thought maybe I'm the wrong person. And at one point I went into the founder of the company and said, after we'd had a remarkable failure, and said, if I were you, I would get rid of me. So yeah, I've had periods of time in which I was not sure that I had things right or was the right person to be in the job.
In that scenario that you just talked about, I assume you're talking about Dick Schultz that you were talking to.
Yes.
What do you think was going through his head during that conversation, and why did he say, no, I want you to stay here and stick this thing out?
That's a good question. He asked me at that time, what did I think needed to be done to fix it? So I presume he agreed with because he gave me the opportunity to do it. I think Dick's sort of visceral thing that he always sort of used as a leader is, does he trust the person? And does he believe in the person? And I think in my case he did. So I think that's why I got the good fortune of he didn't accept my invitation.
And so now that you're on kind of, I wouldn't say the outside looking in, but you're on the periphery as you're retired, but you're still involved. What's that relationship like with the company, the people that work there, and why do you think you still continue to have the passion 9 years after you've retired?
Well, first of all, I have tons of friends. And I have the luxury now of being able to watch them face these issues, and hope and pray they did a better job than I did. And it's quite. I mean, it's so much more fun to be a fan than it is to be a quarterback in this case, because I don't lay awake at night thinking about it the way I did. But when they have some of the victories that they continue to have, it's a really thrill to see. And other people, when you leave a space, that creates more room for other people to step in and bring their game to it. And so I'm having fun watching them do that.
Well, I really appreciate you taking a few minutes to chat. This was really great. It's been fantastic having you here today and getting a chance to hear from you. It's really great.
Well, thanks for making this so much fun.
Good. We'll have to do it again sometime.
All right. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Brad. I appreciate it.
Brad.
So there you have it, our interview with Brad Anderson, and a great time chatting with him. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you tune in for our next episode of Down to Business coming soon. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to Down to Business on iTunes, SoundCloud, wherever you get your podcasts, and to rate and review. We appreciate it, and we'll see you next time.